Hey, everybody. So excited to be with you again. And I have a special friend who's going to join me, Dr. Amina and Rick Lawrence. Hello, my friend.
Hey, how you doing? Hi, Dr.
I,
Raymond.
I am so awesome to see you both. Thank you for being on Instagram Live with me and all the people who love us. And I understand you guys have a new book coming out.
We do. Oh, look, we happen to have it. It's called
Wow.
the Suicide Solution.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's a big title. I mean, I love the title because suicide is a huge problem all around the world. And we're going to have people. I just saw somebody from India, somebody from Sweden, somebody from Spain. Someone saying I'm suicidal. So
Oh,
this is important. COVID tripled depression from January of 2020 to August. I mean, it was just awful. And I was just on CBN, the depression and anxiety disorders in children doubled.
yeah.
So we are at a historically stressful
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Um, talk to me about why you guys wrote the Suicide Solution.
That's good. Well, exactly for what you just stated. It's an extremely stressful time. Unfortunately, suicide has become the answer for many, and it's unfortunately not something that is spoken about or discussed. There's a lot of stigma on just mental health overall, right? And it's one of the reasons why we're so much proponents of brain health, right? Versus just discussing it as mental health. But suicide in particular is something that's not talked about. There's a significant amount of discontent with even just bringing up that topic. When the topic comes up, often it's because something happened. And unfortunately, that's too late. We are hoping to, with this book, be proactive and intentional in this process for those who read it. As you know the stats. Suicide is up, what, 35% overall for all age groups in the last 20 years or so, up to 60% in some of the younger age groups. A million people a year, about a million people a year die by suicide every year. And unfortunately, we don't consider suicide, we sometimes think of suicide as a choice, right? This is some words you said yourself. We sometimes think of it as a choice versus thinking of it as the end result of illness. And this book is about educating on this topic, providing tools, strategies, hope for those who read it.
I think I was thinking, Daniel, too. One thing that I've said to groups that really is a juggernaut thing for them to hear is that if the trends continue, then for 18 to 24-year-olds, suicide is going to become the #1 killer of 18 to 24-year-olds in just the next 2 or 3 years. If the current trajectory continues, that is a staggering thing to say. And I so love what you just said, Daniel, about we've talked a lot about if the vigorous conversation really it only exists after an incident happens, which is really indicative of where we're at right now, instead of before it happens, with some intentionality that is informed by a life of faith and really how Jesus interacted with people himself in a way to bring about whole health in those people. It turns out that those ways, those patterns of interacting with people overlap with what we know clinically and in emerging research around helping people change their narrative from a narrative of death to a narrative of life.
Goodness, such an important topic. I'm so glad you guys tackled this head on. When people are suicidal, they often don't talk about it.
Yeah.
because of the shame.
Yeah.
They don't feel hope that things will change. And this then becomes a solution.
Mhm.
So, what do you talk about as other solutions?
Yeah, we talk about this framework that Daniel lives clinically, the hardware software metaphor for human beings, that our hardware is our biology, our software is our operating system. Just as in a computer, the two need to work together for the computer to work well. If either one of them is if the hardware is damaged or the software has a bug in it, it can end in the dysfunction and destruction of the computer. In the end, the computer can just stop working if those two things aren't working together. And on the software side, we also attach that to story, to the self narrative that we have, and that our self narratives are sometimes planted with contamination stories. A thread of contamination works its way into your self narrative, that if that contamination story is owned and unchallenged, it will lead to the destruction of your identity in the end, which is really where suicidality ends up. So what does it mean to address both the hardware and software side of our wholeness? And the book is really a menu of possibilities on both sides, not a to-do list, but a ample menu of possibilities on both sides of the hardware software issue. You can add to that.
Yeah, I mean, if obviously I work at the Amina clinics, but maybe some of your viewers don't know that. But I've been here now for 7 years, and we have a very particular perspective on how we see our clients, right? And how we create plans and treatment plans to support them in relation to their goals. We think of the biological, psychological, social, spiritual. It's a whole person approach. We call it this holistic type approach. And in many ways, it overlaps with what we are presenting in this book. It's a preemptive approach. Yes, it's a suicide solution, but in many ways, it's a way to live by. There's strategies of understanding how to care for the physical and how to care for the mental, emotional, or spiritual. The reason
So
we use.
people are asking,
Mhm.
the title of the book is called The Suicide Solution,
Yes.
and it's by Dr. Daniel Amina, who is a child and adult psychiatrist, who's trained at UCLA, who has been working at the Amen clinics for the last 7 years. He's just one of my most talented psychiatrists. I adore him. And also Rick Lawrence, who helped him put these ideas together. Really looking at it through the lens of biology. There's a physical functioning, the hardware, if you will, the psychology, how you think, the social circle, who you're connected to, right? When connections blow apart, that's when suicide goes way up.
Mhm.
And your sense of spirituality, your connection to your
Mhm.
deepest sense of meaning and purpose. So, just in that context, I wrote the foreword to the book and I love it. I think it is just so helpful. Daniel, do you have a story from the book that you could share with the people listening?
Yeah. One of my favorite stories was actually one of a client that I work with, and I've worked with for some time, that I actually learned from. I learned from him, and how he's dealt with suicidal thoughts, for years, for decades, even before we started working together, and how he's learned to navigate and manage them. I want to emphasize this story. His name is in the book. We use the name Zane, and he was comfortable with sharing his story. He actually, strangely enough, he one day just sent a summary of kind of what he's gone through, and I was like, "Did you know I was working on a book or something? How did you know to send this? And this is amazing. Would you mind if I shared it?" And he was more than willing to. So Zane's story really just starts out and communicates the point that you can be doing everything right, but your biology can still hit you hard. He had he has a mix of diagnoses. We don't have to get into that, but he had persisting suicidal thoughts, that so much so that literally every day, the thoughts would flash in, these intrusive, dark thoughts. And he would eventually reframe his day to, if I do not harm myself today, if I do not kill myself today, if I do not go buy a gun, if I don't swerve into the other side of the street, if I don't jump off that thing, that's a day of victory. That was his success at the end of the day. Like, imagine that intensity, right? I mean, there are many people who've had thoughts, and I don't want to be triggering for anybody by going too deeply into this, but that's the level of intensity he had of his thoughts. And he was a person of faith. He did all the things right, but biology can impact you. Over time, working on a plan that was comprehensive, that managed that biology, that included the nutrition, the supplements, the medication, but without missing out on his toolbox, which he actually talks about in here, which is a mix of journaling. It was a mix of the people he connected with, the mix of people he supported and empathized with, because he had gone through so much level of pain that he could understand almost anybody's level of pain. And even in the part of his toolbox was reframing his identity, or consistently reminding himself that he's an overcomer, right? His story is so powerful to me. It's shared completely, unedited in the book. I've actually even shared it at one point, even on YouTube or something. It was a pretty amazing story, and I think it's something that can be encouraging to anybody, irrespective of where their suicidal thoughts are. And definitely was encouraging to me as a clinician, because I've learned from him.
Makes me think about that truth that we're narrative people.
Yeah.
That we have a God who's a storyteller, and we're people of story. And what happens when our story gets infected? What happens when we can't seem to get out of the plot line that has helped us to make sense of our story, but is actually killing us? There's a redemptive intent in trying to bring a redemptive thread into our story. How does that happen? And what we're saying is it happens in two ways. You have to have biological interventions in order to lessen the headwinds. And the story side, the software side, has an array of a menu of options of building up a new story, a new plot line in your life that makes sense of your life, but leads to rescue and redemption instead.
Yeah. One of the things you'll see in the book is, as you noticed, is the kind of the back and the forth, the balance here of, I'm coming from the clinical perspective, right? He's coming from the spiritual perspective, and that is almost a conversation point that you'll see mirrored in the book, to make sure that we don't miss other elements or other points of intervention. The reason he's mentioning narrative and story is that it's another way for us to think about that software, that psychological component of it all, without getting too deep into the psychology of it all. We become the story we tell ourselves, right? We become, that's who we, in many ways, we start to live out. If people call us or tell us something about ourselves, we can sometimes live into it. We have to be very intentional about what story we're telling ourselves, because we can sometimes default into destructive narratives, the narratives that lead us to be the less than what we're called to or we're capable of being.
Someone asked how Zane overcame his chronic suicidal ideation.
So great question. Great question. For him, it's I call it a formula. All right. And I don't want to minimize or even oversimplify his perspective. It's a process. In the book, we talked about the idea that if you're stuck in the valley of the shadow of death, it's not a click your heels out type of situation and snap your fingers and you're out. It's a hike out. And there's a process of hiking